Um, cool. So on the motion, this house regrets the significant long-term increase in the negative emotional language in English popular music lyrics, like Prime Minister.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep.
Okay, I'll take my POIs verbally around the 5:30 mark, and I'll start my speech on my first word. Okay, starting in three, two, one, go. When we look at the world today, I think a lot of the issues we have is that people do not understand how to reach out to people and how to get help. They're influenced by the things around them, and they're unable to escape when it leads them down the wrong path. First of all, on some framing, then one main case. First of all, on framing. What exactly is a counterfactual? I think the counterfactual is a world where this negative language exists to a far smaller degree, right? I think the tipping point here is that this language has become too dominant in this form of media. People are far more likely to buy into it to a larger extent. I think this is the largest tipping point. Also, what exactly do we characterize as just negative emotional language? First of all, I think it generally means, like broadly speaking, not exactly the language, but a lot of how the languages are phrased together. I.e., when we talk about certain situations, the emotions that it invokes on us are very negative. People, generally speaking, use very bad language. I feel miserable. All these kind of like negative terms that express negative feelings. I think this is generally speaking like the definition that we will go for this debate. So first of all, moving on to our first case. What exactly is it? First of all, why this causes young impressionable people to romanticize being miserable, and this makes their lives much worse. First point, I think generally speaking, these people in real life, artists especially, take inspiration for their work from their IRL settings. So if you talk about very negative emotions, very things that like bring visceral anger or deep negative emotions to you, and you use that language in your songs, this probably means that your life probably reflects that to a certain degree. This probably means that you have certain traumas in your life that you're able to draw from to bring inspiration, right? Why exactly is this very negative? First of all, I think young people, especially the people who are most hardened by this, and I'll characterize this like why exactly these are the delta, like these young impressionable people. But I think these people are the most influenced by the people and the media that they consume. If they look up to a person who has made a huge impact on their life, this artist who makes songs that they understand and feel very emotionally attached to, they're more likely to take steps to make their life reflect more of what these artists is actually doing, right? So this means that they're more likely to romanticize the events that happen in this artist's life, more likely to pursue the actions that led up to such traumatic events. I think this is broadly bad in many regards. But more on characterizing why exactly these young people are the biggest tipping point. First of all, again, I think that the people who listen to this are mostly young, impressionable people. I think there are several reasons for this. First of all, I think again, I think young people in general consume the most amount of this kind of media. So when you look at the world, they're more likely to consume media that is, for example, like most popular in the current day. They are more likely to hop on trends versus people who are older, who are likely to be more conservative, who are probably entrenched in more like older pieces of media, and they're less likely to like buy into this. But why exactly is it the case that these people are the most vulnerable and the people we should care the most about? First of all, I think that these people in general are very struggling, right? They do not have the experience to navigate through life. There are a lot of issues in current day world, social media, loneliness epidemics that these people are susceptible to, especially since they're young. They do not have the resources necessarily because they're young. They don't have jobs. They don't have all the connections that would make it very easy to escape these holes, right? I think it's especially appealing to these people because, again, young people, generally speaking, want like role models. These people are, again, are actually struggling. They're like more likely to be in, like, for example, parasocial relationships, and to see these artists as role models. Again, there will be people in this debate on either side who will listen to this and not be affected. We are not talking about these people. We're talking about the people who are the most able to be attached to these like pieces of media, right? These are the young people, the people who are struggling in life, and so on. But moving on to more on our case on why this causes people to romanticize uh, uh, struggling. First of all, second point on why this is more likely to form communities revolved around suffering, right? First of all, I think norms exist in communities to create a sense of like belonging, right? I.e., communities are more likely to cause have like a language and vernacular that they use within these groups to distinguish themselves from other groups. I look at, for example, like the Black Pill movement, all of these movements, these social groups, communities that use language that are very specific to themselves. Sometimes it escapes to like the broader like general audiences, but most of the time it stays within themselves in order to make themselves feel like a member of the community. Why exactly is this the case? I think generally speaking, why is this bad? First of all, I think generally speaking, they're more likely to use like the negative language that is used in these songs because it's like very visceral in imagery. They're more likely to use this, and this is very bad. Why exactly is this? First of all, I think again they're more likely to take after the people who are. They're more likely to, for example, romanticize the events happening. If everyone in this group idolizes the members of the band who drew their inspiration from traumatic events, they're more likely to display these events as something to pursue, to be inspired by. And this, as again, when you form it in a group, this
POI
makes it
or
much
O.
worse. Fine, I'll take a POI from O.
So your case is that someone listens to Stand by Eminem talking about a fan that kills himself after Eminem doesn't answer him, and they are more likely to kill themselves as well.
No. I think again, at the end of the day, look, let me think about this. First of all, I don't think necessarily it's the worst cases. I think even in terms of like small traumatic events, people are more likely to like internalize it. They're more likely to see this as something that is not necessarily as bad as it would have been had they talked about it in a like different form of media if they weren't looking up to this. For example, if you were looking at a documentary that was completely informative about this, you'd be more likely to see this through a objective lens versus if you were viewing this through like rose tinted glasses because you like this person so much. Moving on to our third point and why this desensitizes normal people because they use this language. First of all, I think again this is very popular, right? So more people, very a great number of people are exposed to this type of vernacular, this type of language, these situations, and it oftentimes enters enters into like public vernacular, right? So if you look at black people movements, they use like words like fucking black, like chud, or something like words like these words that are like with the originated within these groups, but eventually entered into the mainstream, and people oftentimes use it. Like think about the word like I'm miserable or like I'm always cooked, right? These things came from like very niche settings that eventually became mainstream, and people started using a lot. Why exactly is this very bad? I think that when people start using a like terms so often in their language, it starts to lose their meaning. I.e., if you have something abundance of something, it no longer has the same value as if it was like used very sparingly, right? It no longer holds the same amount of emotional weight. Why exactly is this very bad? I think again, this probably means that when these people in very bad situations come to seek help using this kind of language that they use in their media, this is no longer taken as seriously because everyone now knows about it. Everyone uses this language in their daily vocabulary. So when they start using this language that they exclusively knew about and which held a lot of emotional weight prior to this, everyone is like, oh, this is just like a popular piece of like a reference to this song. Oh my god, this is so cool. They no longer see it as like a way to seek help that is uniquely beneficial, right? And again, this probably becomes cyclical if this person does not get help the first time. They're less likely to seek it in the second time. There are lots of bad impacts, i.e., they're more likely to not seek help in the further. They're more likely to have bad mental health. For all those reasons, so proud to propose.
Cool. I thank the Prime Minister for my speech. And to start, opposition bench, leader of opposition, be ready.
Am I audible?
Yep.
Yeah, cool. Okay. I'll begin in my next word. So I don't think this is an artificial, externally explored trend, but rather that the songs as an art are internal expressions, and now we hear more about it. Firstly, notice that this is mostly about the relationships as in loving relationships, because those are the themes that are more frequent in the songs. People always hear about love songs, and those are the ones that should prevail in the debate. I think that if Taylor Swift is singing about it, she's probably drawing it from her feelings, and she did have a reason for which to feel this way. And so what we're claiming is that people first feel bad about the relationships, and then as a consequence, there's an increase in how this shows up in the love songs in a bad way or portrayed in a more drastic way. So notice that we say that this trend increased firstly from a rise in the female or the oppressed people in relationships now becoming more frequently pop stars or having greater access to becoming popular in music. Why this is relevant? Because as people care about love songs as they have in the last 100 years, when we get the spotlights for the people who previously were kept as being, for a majority, in toxic relationships, oppressed, or being harmed by this sort of relationship, we now give the chance for these people to speak up about how they feel. So notice that this does five things. Firstly, this makes we talk more about the toxic relationships that they are described that they are describing. So what this means is that there's now more discussion or more repercussion in what they're talking in their songs because Taylor Swift is popular and a new album that she publishes inherently brings a lot of attention of the public to the topics that she's talking about in the songs. Meaning, if she's talking bad about a previous boyfriend, there's a greater chance that people now more discuss much more about these toxic relationships. And as a society, there's a greater chance that we do things to avoid this sort of behavior, especially on men. Secondly, notice that it breaks the I can fix him mentality on people who are part or previously existing toxic relationships. Because especially in the comparative, when there's great reaffirming that love is good and you should embrace love, there's a great incentive for people to actually engage in romantic relationships in trying to make things work. But sometimes this is mostly oppressive over the people and a higher burden that they can carry. In the comparative, we fix this by showing people that many relationships, not by the nature of them, but because of how they behave, are bad and we should be apart from them. Meaning, if OG is trying to claim that they get more people going to treatment and trying to seek for psychological help, I say that now people in our side have a greater chance to do so because they see the harms of the relationship and the harms that are caused into them, when in the comparative, they might not do so from the incentives that come from apart. Because notice that in a relationship, there's great incentive for you to keep the fights or whatever's going on private, because those are very sensible feelings for yourself. Thirdly, notice that now when engaging in new relationships, there's a greater chance that people will be more careful into looking who's the guy, because there's a lot of talking about red flags and there's a lot of talking about what can do bad about previous relationship. We're drawing from experience that not only does the individual have, but that Taylor Swift or other pop stars are bringing to the table. What this does is creating in this community, because as OG explains, people create great identification to the songs, this bunch of new material that people should weigh and how much a relationship is contributing to their life. And this is particularly important in the beginning of the relationship, because that's when people are with the rose tinted glasses seeing things greatly. So if people are previously prepared into knowing that the relationship might not end up well, there's a greater chance that they will protect their feelings and actually be more careful about what's going on. And fifthly, notice that this, and most crucially, this increases the validation of feelings that people already have. For the people who are oppressed and are part of this toxic relationships, which have existed in the times of the Beatles, but now are more talked about, there's a positive echo in the minds of these people that it's okay to feel bad and to seek for help or to think ill of that person who's done you horrible things. Meaning, on the comparative, there's a much higher burden on the victim because there's less of this identification to music as a core part of your identity or of your expression of feelings. So now the victims of these relationships feel more validated because their feelings are also felt by mostly like other people who look like them or who feel like them or who behave like them. And this is important because, again, as feelings are kept private in most of the relationships, people most often not talk about how they're feeling bad about like their partner. But now there's a greater chance for them to feel validated because there's someone important, someone who's popular, someone who's on the media who's talking about this sort of thing and actually becoming more popular. I'll take up your iPhone closing if they have any. Opening? Okay. So notice, how's the comparative in the debate? I say that the counterfactual is not only, as opening government tells you, like negative to a smaller degree, but on the comparative, it's much more frequent that people are talking good things about love simply because of the comparative. Notice that this creates or raises idealization of love to a much higher extent. So even if OG is right about some fetish on sadness and that this might affect some people, I say that our impact in victims feeling validated and actually creating a community is much more relevant because on the comparative, there's a pressure to accept these toxic relationships to begin with because they are the ones who take the spotlight of media and of what's taken as popular. Notice, if people value pop music so much, it's not only on the art aspect of it, but most importantly, on the expression of feelings that they bring to these people. When we are listening to the songs, we're actually caring about what's being said. It's not only about the melody. Meaning, if there's this push for idealization, there's an equal fetish, as OG describes, but instead of being on the sadness because your relationship is bad, is on the sadness because you don't feel a part of your relationship, because your partner is oppressive into you, because they don't validate your feelings, because they don't resonate with you. So notice that the comparative is equally bad on how much you don't identify with love, but the call to action for you to actually do something about it or to accept yourself that your relationship is bad is on the comparative less frequent. Thank you.
Cool. I'd like to thank the leader of opposition for a fine speech and remind all speakers that POI accepting or giving POIs are an important part of the game, factor into close decisions, and per manuals factor into speaks. That being said, DPM whenever you're ready.
Am I clearly audible?
Yep.
My next. Hannah, I'm going to begin by doing some refutation. So opening opposition tells you a couple of things. A lot of them are quite assertive. First, they tell you that these negative emotions are primarily focused on like romantic relationships, and more specifically that it's like people talking about being abused and having like these like harms which then lead to discussion and stuff like that. There a couple of things about this are quite assertive. First of all, the idea that this like only extends to like romantic relationships, it is deeply unclear why they characterize it as such. You can just talk about general depression, about not feeling like happy or whatever. Like I don't know, like any XXX Temptation song, whatever. Like there's like a lot of variety to this. And secondly, when it is romantic, they also assert that it is like victims coming forward with the story. That is also like very assertive because why does it necessarily have to be victims? It is just specifically negative language, which just talks about like just different like aspects of whatever situation in like a sad way, like you're mad about it, you're sad about it. You could be like the abuser, you could be romanticizing like toxic behavior. Empirically we know this to be like the case a lot of the time. We also know that in cases where people do talk about the abuse that they face, they oftentimes romanticize it to cope with it, or like to make it like more shocking, or to make it like aesthetic. Like there's a lot of old cultural tropes that this plays into. Like for example, artists like Lana Del Rey will have like famous quotes like "he hit me and it felt like a kiss." It is deeply unclear why the characterization that they give is the correct one. Next, they tell you that this necessarily like leads to more discussion. It is unclear why this specifically is the tipping point on more discussion, considering that on our side we still have like access to the same like impacts of uh, having like these negative emotions discussed in music, just at being at like a lower level or not experiencing the significant rise, which is like mentioned in the motion. But also there's other ways in which discussion can occur. For example, like through forums with parents, with friends at school, through like shows and TV shows. And I feel like these avenues generally are far better because they are less incentivized to create an unnuanced, like very aestheticized aspect of it, because most other forums for discussion are like more long form. They allow for like more nuance, more description. Versus here is just like kind of this shocking graphic image a lot of the times describing like things that are very violent or like extreme and stuff like that. Especially as artists try to like compete with each other as this norm becomes like more popular, and it raises competition. So yeah, discussion can occur in other ways. They also tell us that, well, the way that people engage with this is going to mean that they are going to see the harms of these abusive relationships, and then they're going to take this advice and impact it in like, or sorry, use it like in their life for the better. Again, it is deeply unclear why people will generally engage with this logically. Eric tells you like several things which kind of contradict this, and he actually mechanizes it. For example, the idea that these artists a lot of the times romanticize these like harmful behaviors, harmful emotions, in ways that make it hard to interact with it logically because it is done in the form of metaphor, because it is like allegorical. Also because people might not be incentivized to engage with it logically because they have a parasocial relationship with the artist. They just have like respect them. They buy into what they're saying and they feel like it's relatable. It is unclear why they're going to then not only like evaluate this logically, but also then use it for like the positive and like implement it in their life in some way. And ultimately, we tell you that like this is not exclusive. This exists on either side of the house. Then let's talk a bit more about sort of like the delta here.
Before
We
this,
feel like on either side, I'll take POIs later. On either side, there's people who will kind of like listen to negatively charged music. This music will exist either way. The delta that we're talking about are people who would have not sought out this music in the counterfactual, but stumble upon it because the like Instagram, YouTube, Spotify algorithm things that like would appeal to them. Whatever. These are people who a lot of the times are quite vulnerable and who are structurally like not capable of engaging with this in healthy ways. This is not necessarily always the case. However, there is a far higher margin of these people because of their age, because of their vulnerability, because young people oftentimes like struggle with making friends or having a social life or fitting in society. So they feel like they have to turn to these like artists who like relay their like what they feel in like ways which are like really cathartic for them or whatever. However, we feel like this is generally harmful at the point where people are not like actively seeking this out because they probably would have been fine either way. And they if they wanted to seek it out, they could. But the issue, like when this is like kind of like given to people who are not able to engage with it critically, they come away from it like worse essentially. They come away from it like a lot of the times romanticizing these feelings, not feeling like they need to seek help, not feeling like they need to like actually like take medication or whatever because they think their mental illness is something that makes them special. Why is this likely to occur in a lot of cases? Because artists which are very popular and talk about like these kinds of extreme niche things will always have like communities that talk about this and like Discord and Reddit, whatever. And within these communities, echo chambers are created where people gradually develop more and more extreme beliefs on the basis of like what the artist was talking about, which can a lot of times lead to like the like peer pressure to like engage in self harm or like engage in like bad relationships or engage in other unhealthy like body like practices like starving yourself or something like that. I'll take any POIs if there are any, either opening or closing. Okay.
why is it so bad that negativity reflects the realities of life, given that your prime minister says that it reflects the trauma from work and real life? Aren't you suppressing what is
Yes,
real in
I
society?
got it. Thank you. I think that the reason why it's so bad is not like it, first of all, it's not bad in like every single case. It's bad in the cases where people are very vulnerable. And furthermore, this is not merely a relation of what these artists feel. It is a dramatized relation. It is like done to like an aesthetic music video. It is done with beautiful poetic words like, oh, and like I don't know, like her porcelain skin shattered in the rain. I don't know, like whatever. They make it sound really appealing, which makes it people romanticize their mental illnesses and the struggles they're dealing with, which makes it less likely that they'll seek help from like their parents or counselors or whatever because they see it as an integral part of their identity. They fear like losing their community even if they're not being directly peer pressured. Um, Eric also tells you that mental health as a whole becomes like slightly more stigmatized, probably, which is a really large scale impact that you should care a lot about as it becomes associated with like young people, very dramatic people, people who don't always have like the best self presentation. And it just generally makes music like less enjoyable, especially for people who want to avoid the negativity. They have less artists that they can listen to now. For these reasons, proud to propose.
Cool. I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for a fine speech. I invite the yellow to summarize top half whenever they're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does everyone hear me?
Yeah, perfectly audible and visible.
Great. Thank you. I transfer the POIs through the chat or through the Zoom reaction. I'll be looking at it and I will be taking it as they appear. I'll start in a couple seconds. In 3, 2, 1. But now I want you to look at opening government's case in the realistic sense. The claims are basically that by looking at those broadly negative songs, that is going to lead to romanticization and lead to people repeating them. I think that is already shown why it's ridiculous by my POI. I don't think someone that is singing like a song about Rihanna saying that saying that she's going to burn their house on fire because of something that X says is actually going to burn the house on fire. I think they are more likely to relate to the experience and to the reasons and emotions that are going throughout that, mainly the anger, mainly the revolt, and that we think these are the things that are most necessary for them to actually relate to, and when they are more likely to be present in mainstream music and more likely to appear to them, that's when we actually get these people to be empowered enough to break out of these toxic relationships and actually get to a better life on their life. Well, I have two main pushes that I have to put here against them in that regard. Firstly, they say how this is the most romanticization of being miserable actually will lead to the worsened life of these people that are in critical conditions. I have two responses to this. Firstly, I think they most deal with the worst cases. I think the person that will like cut themselves because of songs romanticize as cutting themselves or killing themselves or something like that is already in such a bad mental state that it's not a song being negative or positive that is going to make a bit the difference out of it. And I think as well when they talk about fans having a parasocial relationship with the artist, if they are in such a parasocial and extreme relationship where they are such a like introspective and like solitary person that they only seek any validation and only learn so anything else from the artist, I think broadly two things. Firstly, I think they already do crazy things and all, despite regardless what is social, because by their own characterization they lack the critical sense to actually separate what the song says in the lyrical sense and the artistic sense from the reality. So I think even if they had like positive language, the moment that the artist take artistic liberty to say something in a more exaggerated manner, they will also do exaggerate things that will be bad for them. So I don't see how these people are actually relevant inside of this debate, aside as well of being a minority of cases. I think most people that listen to these songs actually have the critical sense of not be following them and understanding what is the intent of the artist to the letter as well. But secondly, I think it's uncomparative because on their side of the house, these kind of people, if we had a song that were like more neutral or more positive tone, either they wouldn't listen to the songs at all, and also by their own characterization, they would still be stuck on those echo chambers that they said on like Reddit or on the social media that we actually think are the main drives before they do these harmful acts or the harmful acts on their side of the house as a whole. But I also think secondly on their side that either way they would not be likely to still listen to negative tones because on their side the negative tones is not mainstream, and these kind of people who also seem to be more introspective and also seem like to hate more everybody, they also tend to have to harbor this hatred society and be stuck in those echo chambers, also are of the opinion that like mainstream music is bad and we should listen to alternative music, which is likely to have all of these negative tones that they portray on their side. So I think this whole case of theirs on like mentally ill people is largely uncomparative because they listen to evanescence on both sides of the house. Secondly, they try to tell you how the negativity becomes meaningless because it's repeated. I think actually it's the opposite. I think on their side of the house specifically, and also what we have, and the reason why we have a rise of this on the long term and a great increase in that regard, is that positivity is the norm. Two analysis on this. Firstly, notice that this acts as a necessary counterweight because normally negative emotions are frowned upon, and you're teaching upon from a young age that you shouldn't display them. So when your parents always teach you to be smiling, they always teach you to not swear or not use bad words because they portray negative emotion, and that's seen as socially bad or like inadequate. Or also, for instance, people are mostly uncomfortable when people are crying, when they're like showing anger, and they see those emotions through stigmatized lenses. If their point is these things become more meaningless, I think we actually see this this is a good thing because that means that now people are normalizing being sad. People are normalizing, or actually this on their sides, being sad is being something that is bad and that needs to be hidden and that is meant to be comfortable to people, which leads to more people bottling up their sadness, bottling up those negative emotions, which is more likely to leave people into the mentally ill state that they claim to be so important in this debate as well. But secondly, that notice as well that on their counterfactual, actually most of the mainstream music then is actually showing romanticized and idealized version on everything. So we have more positive tones. We have music, for instance, when they talk about love and relationships, like the Beatles, or like how the love is perfect, how she's the girl of my life, or everything else, like how every single moment is happening and how I found the person that I'm looking for. And for the same reasons that I gave on my previous mechanism, the positivity tends to be frowned or negativity tends to be frowned upon. The challenge on that is the reason why we have the rise and why we think there is something that is positive in the bad case. They also try to challenge us and say, like, well, why love songs and relationships are the main case of this debate. I think this is broadly intuitive. Most of the top songs tend to be about relationships, not only about love, but relationships in all the way, like hookup culture, like any way you can think of relationships in that regard, from two main reasons. Firstly, since musics are expressions of artists, and artists tend to go for music expression in what they feel emotions the most, relationships tend to be often a topic or a topic where they feel strongly upon to write those songs. But also, secondly, knowing that love is a universal and sympathetic emotion that everyone feels at some point, and everyone enters a relationship at some point, the recorders and publishers also have incentives in profit to actually push for these songs and want them or publishers like to write the lyrics and hire the people that write lyrics that related to that, because they know someone will always relate to it and always listen. That's why we think so far, when you look at the top 10 songs that are always on the build-up for the month, they are mainly relationship songs. And there is the impact of her case, as my partner already told you. We think only by the negativity being normalized, and only by the negative being something that you can see in these songs, and not the counterfactual, they only like positive and show the idealized, you can break from the toxic relationship cycles. Because then, especially when you're a moment of more introspective, when you don't want to talk to anybody, when you see your pattern in a like idealized way, even if they're really toxic, is those songs that give you the anger, those songs that give you the revolt, those songs that give you actually like the courage and give you the flame to relate to them when you're more introspective, to challenge it, to deal better with your emotions, and to actually feel that, yeah, my partner is actually worthless and I should swap for one. Even in the worst cases, where actually that sets up you for flavor, you actually would have a great relationship, but you actually fall for these musics. I think it's better to miss out on a great relationship than be stuck on a toxic one where you're constantly abused, or either verbally or physically, where your self-esteem goes to the trash, and again, you're more likely to develop those mental illness. I think this rise is actually a great liberation for those women that tend to be the victims. Because again, refuting them, if you are the victim, obviously you do negative tones. If you are the aggressor, you do positive or negative tones. The speech ended. Proud to oppose.
Cool. I'd like to thank the DLO for a fine speech. Remind all speakers that POI is an important part of the game factor to close decisions. Not taking them will affect speaks and will affect close margins. Additionally, the POIs are offered between the first and 6th minute exclusively. That being said, thank you. Top half, now to stop the back half. Member of government when you're ready. Cool. I'd like to thank the member of government for a fine speech. Remind all speakers again, POI is an important part of the game factor into close decisions and speaks. With that being said, member of opposition to commence closing opposition's case whenever they're ready.
Okay, my hair is so bad right now, but it's okay. Yeah, if anybody's not ready, speak now. If not, I'll begin my really fun, awesome speech on my first word. First, some notes on framing. So like throughout this debate, people have been basically agreeing that like life sucks, right? You're depressed, you have bad relationships, potentially abusive ones. I also want to add that like politically things suck. So like in the Western world, there's been sort of there's been growth forever that's starting to slow down. So people aren't having the same upward mobility. Urbanization and globalization are hollowing out towns. People just feel like there's a lot of oppression because of the rise of the right, for example, in America especially, and like the nuclear umbrella, which has been protecting everyone, is going away. So like life really sucks. Songs are a symptom when they're sad of this life sucking, not the source of it. And this is pretty intuitive, right? Music has to like meet an existing need. So it's not just that like music comes in and makes people sadder. The people are already sad and the music meets that sadness. Secondly, let's note that like awareness matters for people to get help. You can only solve an issue if people know about it and there's resources to go to it. So like when mental illnesses were not discovered properly and not understood properly, there weren't things to like help people because people didn't know how to have those helps. People also like the demand was unknown, so there wasn't supply to meet it. So like to help people, we need a certain awareness and representation of those issues. Let's also know that like mental health issues are like important, but they're not the most important issues in the realm. They already have treatment, they already have awareness because same thing with bad relationships, because rich people also suffer from like mental health issues. They also suffer from bad relationships. That's how you have like networks for people with domestic abuses. That's how you have like pretty robust therapeutic care in the English speaking world. But what you don't have, because like rich people will find a solution for their issues as much as they can. However, it's minorities who really like struggle the most because you don't have that same representation. You don't have that same sort of impact that they have the ability to do because they lack the money and therefore they don't have the same solutions. Final note of framing, just to balance things out, and this is partially also a response to CG. let's note that just like happy music still exists. I want to balance out this debate. It's not just like, oh wow, we used to do happy music, now we're switching to sad music. 7 reasons why this is true. One, just like the old happy songs still exist, right? So the motion assumes a shift. You still have the oldies, and people listen to those because of nostalgia. People listen to those because they're on the spot. And those songs get added to Spotify. You can go listen to Frank Sinatra singing about how much he loves life. Secondly, people like diversity. This is true about the artists who aren't just like chasing cash. They're already really rich. They can retire if they're just chasing cash, right? They also want to like make music they enjoy, make music that represents their life, which is diverse, make music that represents their artistic interest, which might be diverse, but also people are diverse. So if you're listening to sad music, you want to also listen to other music because you just like multiple things. People want diversity, so they don't just listen to sad music. Thirdly, happy music is profitable. Lobbies, malls, these things play happy music, right? They're not gonna play music that's like screaming "fuck my life," as like elevator music or things like that. And that's probably the like a ton of streams you get right there, and a ton of awareness. So like happy music is still profitable. For Yeah, I think this is for let's just do like family friendly music. So like radios are more likely to play happy music because if you're like sitting in the back of a car, or if you're like expecting to be played in cars where families are, you're not going to be like this visceral sad music. So like sad music is actually disadvantaged in the market because there's a lot of opportunities for it lost. So like the market factors that O mentioned get flipped. Let's also know that there's like other happy influences in life. So like celebrities who people look up to, as we've said, tend to be sort of happy people because one, they don't want to seem like assholes in interviews. Look at like what happened to Chappell Roan, who like made really popular music, but like lost streams because she seemed ungrateful. These people are also like really rich, so they just tend to be happier. OG's framing that they're like influencing people to be sad isn't true. People have a lot of influences in their life to be happy. Sad music is just another sort of tool in the like very large existence of like things that exist. Let's talk about why it's a helpful tool. We've got two main points for why this will help people. One is that it'll galvanize people to action, especially political action, and secondly, that it'll like help
Yeah,
people find unity. Sure.
yeah, well, it's true that people can listen to positive music that or they have like other avenues to address their issues. The issue is that this music intercepts it for really vulnerable actors and gives them an incentive not to seek it out for fear of losing their
So I'll show in a
community or
moment why they're
identity.
more like I'll show in a moment why they're more likely to seek help when they listen to the sad music, but also they're forced to see the happy music as well through like the fact that it's played in lobbies and malls. So like it's just not true that they're even if they're really vulnerable, they're not just seeing sad music. Okay, other things don't work to galvanize people, right? We're talking about really hard choices, coming forward against an abuser, changing political systems. People are dealing with really tough issues. These tend to require a certain emotional cost. So just like a pamphlet isn't enough, you need something that's somewhat emotional to actually galvanize people. Music can only fulfill that role. Music is also really digestible. It's short. You can feel it when it has that visceral language. So you don't need to be like a lit major to understand music in the same way you might need to like understand books. So it has a unique ability to activize people. It's also just clearer under opposition world. So when you're using visceral language like fuck the government, you understand the political message. If it's saying like fuck Trump, that's understandable. So music is able to like reach people in a way that other things aren't because of its digestible and clear nature. It also has like a sort of political effect. So like music is inherently political often. So punk music, for example, even the Taylor Swift songs mentioned have like feminist aspects to them. So they have the ability to like inform people about political aspects of their lives. It's also like able to be used for political activism because it's very communal. So people sing things like the Internationale and Bread and Roses, which is like the song of the DSA, together as a group, which is like really important for political movement because people must like sort of coalition together. The alternate is things like treatises, which don't have the same impact. So music has like a unique ability to like move people to hard action, specifically political action. It also spreads really quickly because of like quick hits. It's really short. It gets played on like TikTok and things like that. Here's why this music must be like specifically negative to politically galvanize people. One is just like anger is a necessary emotion sometimes, right? Like anger often moves people to action more than joy. But secondly, like when hope feels lost, happy music about like what could happen isn't enough because right now people don't believe in it. As we said, life sucks. People don't have that same upward mobility. So they need the political music to galvanize them, and they need the anger in particular to galvanize them. This only works under opposition. Here's why political systems are the most important. One, the political systems like affect the mental things because they're much more wide ranging, right? If you can't get a job, you're probably going to be happy. Two, the political systems like affect minority people who like lack the ability to advocate otherwise. So it's really important that we have the ability to overturn these. Let's talk about like community now. Feelings are pretty internal. But when you listen to music, you start to get in a community. This is pretty like uh disagreed with right now. You go to concerts for that artist, you talk online about it. Here's where these communities, one, are probably better for your mental health. Artists want to be good role models. So if people are like committing self-harm in these communities, the artists will shut that down. If their music is leading to people being more depressed, right? The artists will lose streams, they'll lose record contracts. So like that'll lead them being more depressed. People also aren't alone. They can talk to other people who are in the community. People eventually get better and then they share advice with the community. But also this is particularly important for like minorities. So minorities like struggle to find community otherwise because they're often prevented from doing that because of like the government. You can see this with like pro-Palestinian protests and ICE. This gives them a safe space. It's also important that like queer people, especially who are distributed throughout the world, the importance of this is like we stop them from feeling alone. We give them networks with each other to like gain resources. If a queer person is kicked out of their parents' house, the musical community like allows them to find other people to stay with. Creating these resources with minorities is most important because these are like the most vulnerable people. They have no other avenues to find support. So it's the terminal impact of this round. Thus, so proud to oppose. And I've got to go. Let's.
Cool. I'd like to thank the member of opposition for fine speech and return to closing governments that can come with a whip. Please summarize opposition bench whenever they're ready.
I'll just.
First, why do we have underrepresentation of minority voices in mass media? And second, why is this representation important? First, Daniel tells you that there's a reason for why we get this significant long-term increase in negative language. And that's because first, barriers to entry fell for music writers. With the popularization of social media platforms and Spotify, it became easier to self-publish. It also meant that big music studios had less ability to prevent music from actually getting out, right? Because now there's less profit incentive when you can simply publish on Spotify. So their power goes down. But second, the cost of access and ownership of songs fell. Previously, you needed to buy like a $20 like VCD, right? You need a VCD player, it's quite expensive, and it's hard to bring it around. But now, music it can be easily accessed on your computer, and most people have phones. We think that music has become far more mainstream. It's created entirely new markets, and these markets include previously marginalized demographics, like the gay and queer community and the African-American communities. So what Daniel is trying to say is that in the past, the supply of negative music was suppressed despite broad underlying demand for negative music. And the reason why you get this increase is simply a reflection of changing societal dynamics, which we think is positive. The upshot of all of this is that singers, including minority singers with experiences of discrimination, were in the past not able to publish songs which fully represented the breadth of their experiences and the amount of discrimination they face. Even if they're able to break into the market in the 1970s, a few of them, like Michael Jackson, they often had to go through publishing houses which were owned by whites and who were extremely risk-averse and who were only willing to publish positive songs that could appeal to the broad market. So what we're trying to say is that in our world, we at least have some balance of representation of English language music, of positive versus negative. We don't get over-representation of negative music. It's merely a reflection of how people feel, and we think that there's nothing wrong with that. Daniel tells you 3 implications. First, there's still more positive songs which people can access, right? He gave you 7 reasons why. Like, the POI is that while negative music tends to crowd out positive music if you're feeling very negative already. But ultimately, people still go to work, they're still on the train, they'll still listen to different kinds of songs. Besides, if you scroll social media, you're likely to get some kind of diversity of songs despite the sorting mechanism, right? Because people social media companies recognize that people have monotonic preferences. They oftentimes want something new, something that kind of piques their interest, something that is refreshing, different from what they already know. Second, if people choose to access negative songs, there are deeper underlying reasons why. Listening to negative songs is not a root cause of mental health issues, but a symptom. And there are many other reasons, as more effective ways in which we can redress mental health issues. For example, by expanding mental health treatment. But even if negative songs are popularized, songs tend to be more nuanced, right? So it's not 100% negative. It tends to give hope to people. Why is this true? Because artists, especially those who have had the most negative experiences and who see their music as a form of advocacy, tend to be pragmatic. They want to leave a legacy because they see themselves as a person of action and influence within their communities, and they want to encourage the communities to act on their messages. Hope gives people the belief that they can and makes them more likely to act. Negative language is often used as a means to an end. It's to create a context for which people can yearn for something better, to change something in their lives, in their communities. The presence and recognition of suffering is encapsulated by negative language, creates the impetus to address issues of suffering. The upshot is this. If negative language is balanced by some kind of hope, some kind of positivity, then you're unlikely to get mass mental health impacts as described by OG and CG. Why is it then important that we get representation from singers who use negative language? First, because people who have had negative life experiences tend to come from disenfranchised communities. Songs are a form of catharsis and self-expression. It's a way of sharing your identities from others. And these kinds of experiences tend to be accurate because, as someone rightly pointed out, artists are kind of poor, so they don't do it for some kind of profit incentive. They oftentimes do it because they really believe in it. They could have gotten a more stable job. Second, songs represent experiences that run counter to the establishment. is literally a form of counterculture because the establishment has every incentive to downplay negativity, to make you think that everything is fine, that the capitalist structures need not be changed. Why is this accurate representation so important for marginalized communities? First, catharsis is way more effective for people who have been left behind by society. Always says, well, people need to redress their suffering. What I'm trying to say is that you get more accurate depictions of suffering, of discrimination, of hate crimes out there because of the negative language, the severity of the language used. And this accurately represents the community suffering. But second of all, Daniel tells you that songs have focal point which brings communities together. CJ tells you why songs are more effective than other mediums in speaking to people. We fully agree, right? First, songs are communal, it's easily integrated into group experiences. For example, singing at church, shouting your voice. Second, songs are highly accessible, digestible. For example, it's easily played on reels. It can be spread through social media very easily. Third of all, songs take less time to listen to compared to books, documentaries, or movies. It's more like it can be more easily internalized. This looks like popular songs being played when queer friends huddle together. And songs are oftentimes played in gay bars, which first brings people to gay bars, second allows people to let the guard down. People feel more connected to others because they feel like they share the same common language as a collective. This is the most important impact in this round, independent of any other benefit. Because even if people feel sad, even if people have challenges, if songs bring people together, and these are the most vulnerable groups of people, they know that they have other people to turn to. At least they have slightly stronger social safety nets amongst people who truly understand them, who share their identity, who share their characteristics. We tell that songs create more communities. But second of all, notice that negative songs are the most effective mechanism to galvanize social movements. I'll take a POI if there's any.
Yeah, so first of all, the counterculture that you're describing is symmetric. Secondly, all of the mechs on minority communities are contingent on the rise of mass streaming, which is also symmetric and not exclusive to negative language.
This is not true because we told you that the depth of suffering can only be expressed by negative language. And this depth is what really speaks to people, is what allows minority communities to fully express themselves and to feel that they're part of popular culture. Second of all, what does CG say? They say, I'm galvanized against ICE because I see ICE doing bad things. It's not about the songs. But first of all, we tell you that, unlike most debaters, there's a real lack of awareness, right? Like, just look at social media. Not everyone is going to get news of ICE shooting people, right? Not everyone gets the political news. They oftentimes get reels. And these popular music gets more currency because it can be tied to like the latest social trends that youth listens to, right? But second of all, there's an activation energy barrier before it acts. So before that, and you see ICE shooting people, I feel very angry, right? But now you hear your favorite singer, who's your role model, who's part of your community, speaking out about it. Now you want to act. Now you go out and protest. Now you donate to political campaigns. And this is especially important, right? Because there's extremely high cost to engage in activism due to youth apathy. But the third thing is that even if these songs are more sensational, we at least get broad-based support. And broad-based support is ultimately what results in real political change for the most underprivileged people. Daniel tells you that anger is the most effective way to galvanize people. It's only through anger that you can actually get people out, and you only get anger when you've got negative language.
Cool. I'd like to thank the opposition whip for a fine speech and all the debaters for a good debate. We'll see you all in 15 minutes. The debaters could leave the room,
everyone.
and then we'll
Thank
invite you back
you.
in.
Thank you very much for the debate.
So could Mary, Eric, and DLO please leave the room? Don't worry, it'll make sense in a second. Darius, could you please leave the room? Darius.
Yeah.
Cool. Before I go on, there is also an intention to record panel discussions. Obviously, that requires you giving consent as well. No pressure if you do not want to give consent. The same issues will apply, as in you can redact consent after the panel discussion if you'd like to. Are you both okay to be recorded for this? No worries if not.
Sure.
Rhythm, is that okay?
Yeah, I'm okay.
Okay, so if you want to take a minute to look up your notes, come up with an initial call, and we can get started with the discussion.
I'll just need 1 minute and then
Yeah,
I'll
no
start.
worries.
William, I have to leave for like 2 minutes. I might be able to join later, but if I'm not able to, you can remove me from the tab. I'm so sorry about
Okay,
this.
sure. No, that's okay.
Okay.
Okay, so it's just us two. Cool. Do you need any more time, or are you ready to get started?
I feel like I do have an initial call. I can say it out loud.
Yeah, cool. Go ahead.
From first to fourth, I have
Mhm.
opening opposition on first. I have opening government on second, closing opposition on third, and closing government on fourth.
Cool. I largely agree. I think the long diagonal comparison between opening government and closing opposition is one that is quite close. But apart from that, I think everything seems fairly in order. So the way this panel discussion will work, since we have the same initial call, is we're just going to try to focus on the comparisons that I think are closer. So we'll start with long diagonal. If you think other comparisons are close, we can prioritize the discussion that way. So if we start with long diagonal then, so we both have opening government beating closing opposition. The reason I think the comparison is close is whilst I think a lot of
Don't we
closing
like
opposition material.
before that, don't we have to wait for the panelists' call?
No, I think the panelist said he was leaving because he had to leave. And since we only have 15 minutes, if he comes back in 2 minutes, then we'll reintegrate him in the discussion.
All right. Okay,
Uh,
so before that, can I get your call first from top to bottom, just for clarity?
oh no, I have the same call as you do.
Oh,
So
oh, all
about
right, all right.
OTC. Yeah. So if
Cool.
we look at the long diagonal, which I think is the closest comparison in the round, I think the reason this comparison is particularly close is whilst I think a lot of closing opposition material is intuitively correct, as in negative music can, by its nature, sometimes be galvanizing to political action, I think there's an absence of engagement with the way in which communities play out when negative music is the focal point. And indeed, this is just an absence of responsive interaction, particularly to DPM's mechanization. With that specific question, is that the reason why you would have closing opposition under opening government, or are there other reasons why?
I feel like majorly the reason I keep opening government above the closing opposition uh, is majorly because I think, just a minute, I'm finding the arguments. Yeah, I think OG's case rests on two things, that is romanticization of struggle and like normalization the distress and negative language lose emotional weight over time. I think then CO has the simple idea that the central extension is that negative music from marginalized communities creates collective cultural identity and the shared suffering becomes the most important argument that, or like the most important impact that CO then actually talks about. I think then the reason that I keep opening government above closing opposition is majorly because of three clashes. I think one on tokenization, but then secondly on language losing its meaning and the idea of the struggle actually losing its meaning. But then lastly, the like who it actually harms upon. The last clash on who it actually harms, I think that like opening government locates harm in vulnerable listeners who internalize negativity much more. But then CO locates benefit out of the marginalized communities who finally have the cultural representation. The reason I believe that opening government takes over is because the cultural impact that closing opposition wants to bring out is first of all very limited, but closing opposition also does not weigh the idea of why in general listeners are more important versus the community. I think then the idea of opening government's tokenization is much more important because the artists that sugarcoat the struggle to sell themselves directly threatens CO's extension. So if artists are performing the artists are performing commercially rather than authenticity representing the community experience, then the cultural validation that I think the whip talked about is like very manufactured and not very genuine. And then CO does not really deal with this idea of how it's actually genuine and not manufactured, and they never cleanly answer this. I think then the op whip is just simply asserting this idea of artists actually representing their communities. I think that was not very well mechanized and well weighed out. I think then opening government wins over closing opposition for me.
Yeah, I would largely agree. I particularly think the POI DPM offers to opposition whip at the end of the speech can be quite damaging, where they point out that the reasons opposition whip points to why minorities now get representation, i.e., reduced barrier of entry for streaming, is a symmetric consideration. So on both sides of the house, there's going to be minority representation. If it's the case that DPM is correct that there are alternative forms of community that would exist outside negative representation that will be more nuanced, etc., This makes me start to question how authentically unique minority representation would be through negative music. Indeed, arguments about how it's more motivating, a recognition of struggle, communal, and common language are all either softly uncomparative or DPM has already generated explanations to why they would be damaged by negative music, as in it's less communal because you're forced to do negative actions to yourself, or you lose the common language, as you say, gets tokenized and eroded. Cool. So that solidifies, I think, what I thought was a close comparison. Let's move up to call then. I think closing government, I think, are more clearly not positioning higher in the round. Do you want to give a brief explanation to why you think that is true?
For closing government and opening government, right?
Yeah.
All right. I think the reason I had closing government before, or like below opening government, majorly because I think CG, I think, struggles most in the round because I think the artist financial barriers argument is I think is the most original material in the round that CG talks about, but it's underdeveloped and CO correctly identifies it at a largely symmetric. I think then streaming has lowered barriers for everyone, and the trend towards negative music would presumably reward negative artists financially but not punish them. I think they lose to opening government because CG is not able to extend their extension to the extent that they actually want to win this round. So I think there's less explanation of their extension. They're not able to prove to them like the idea of other forms of alternatives being more important for dealing with negative emotions, or like how other forms of alternatives are not actually impacting the negative emotions much worse. I don't think I could find any sort of explanation on that. The CG then lastly loses below opening government, majorly because I think the government whip correctly identifies the political activism through music argument, but I don't think they spent enough time on actually proving their case of how it actually creates any sort of change. I think in one line, I think closing government had extension, but they were not able to explain why the extension is more important, and then they were not able to weigh out why the extension is more important than anything else. I think then largely of their case feels a bit symmetric because even if opening government talks about artists like losing out their like idea of making music, and then emotions feeling less weighed down, or like emotions not being very taken seriously, CG does not expand on that, does not impact on that, and does not have any sort of explanation of why that's more important than OG's case. I think for that reason.
Yeah, I largely echo this. I think the most predominant extension by closing government, as in it forces artists to comply to negative music, seems strictly uncomparative, as in if it's the case that now you have like predominantly positive stuff, which is opening opposition's push, and presumably that's also coercive. Secondarily, on their argument of escaping, that's like it provides escapism and actually doesn't make you change your behavior, which is the same slash opening government identifies. I think the opening government mechanization is far more robust, even if it is not like wonderful, to demonstrate why music does prevent you from being able to escape.
I just have one question between OG and CG to like solidify for me even more. I had this idea that opening government's romanticization argument, I think, is a bit underdeveloped, but they're more direct in causing the harm or like causing the impact they want to. Then closing government adds the idea of artists having a lot of barriers, which I think is the extension they wanted to run, but they were not able to do it very, cleanly, or like very like properly explaining it wise. Do you think the idea of romanticization that OG runs is more important than artist barriers?
So I think there are a number one, yes, and then number two, I think there are lots of other reasons opening government has provided to explain why people who listen to music are more damaged. So responding to I agree with your first commentary, which is I'm unclear why artists themselves are a more important stakeholder around the people who consume the music, largely because there's more people who are consuming the music, etc. But yeah, that is my response to that question.
Cool, got it.
So lastly, let's talk about we are currently at 5 minutes, so let's spend the remaining 2 minutes positioning opening opposition. Opening opposition versus opening government. Do you want to give me 30 seconds? So think justification for why you think opening opposition is able to be opening government.
Sure. I think opening opposition wins because leader of opposition reframes that negative language as recognition, not romanticization, which means that they hold prime minister and hold opening government. They never distinguish the naming pain from glorifying it, which means that the opening government is not really able to differentiate of how people actually assume music and how they assume their emotions aligning with music. So the counterfactual on idealization directly invert opening government's harm, or like the entire story of it, and goes unanswered. I think then opening opposition sets the terms more wider, more broader, and OG then simply fights on their own grounds.
Okay, cool. Yeah. The only thing I would add is I think even if I don't think opening opposition is able to entirely dismantle the notion that some people, or I don't even know how many people, will end up romanticizing the figure, but there's still lots of other justifications to explain why the most extreme actions that would come from romanticization are unlikely to happen or to consider symmetrically. I think the strongest push of opening opposition is to say that sadness is currently stigmatized in society. So there's actually a countervailing force that allows individuals to engage in sadness and interactions with sadness. That I think is particularly important for then challenging the notion that being sad makes you more likely to do harmful things to yourself, as opening opposition says, people also tend to do harmful things to themselves when they suppress their sadness. I think this is when interacting with opposition bench, a equally as powerful justification for why we need this than saying and closing opposition, this is a reflection of people's intrinsic desires, which I think is a different way of explaining what opening opposition has said, but not necessarily a better way. Cool. The last thing I would do is then on opposition bench. I think opposition bench comes down to a few questions here. So I do think member of opposition has alternative routes, particularly, well, opposition whip has alternative routes to describe what opening opposition are talking about. The questions in margin of proof, the comparative strength, particularly on what the alternative types of communities and music look like. Question of responsive challenges. I don't think, as we said earlier, closing opposition is responding as strongly to opening government as opening opposition did. This is largely the reasons why I place opening opposition generically above closing opposition. Are there any other comparisons you should talk about in the round, or should we proceed to ballot?
I think for opening and closing opposition, I'll quickly summarize this because I think largely closing opposition had their case of why happy music also exists, but there was less weighing on that. I think my question was if happy music exists already, but it does not mean that the popularization of negative music is going down. So people are still listening to negative music much more. That's the first thing. I think then secondly, the idea of why vulnerable listeners are any better, which means that the people already in crisis separate artists from reality regardless of the lyrical content. And I think this was in DLO first of all, which means that this was never directly engaged or like or not directly weighed out by the closing opposition at all. Which means that which means that the closing opposition's larger impact of universal language gestures toward music's unique emotional accessibility, but they don't specify or like specifically answer why vulnerable listeners are better served by negative music than opposed to like being harmed by it. So like they were not able to answer why happy music exists, but why people are going to tend to happy music much more. That's my majority of the reasoning.
Okay. I do think there are some reasons in closing opposition to say why negative music is bad, but I don't think they're any better than opening opposition's reasons, particularly in response to challenge to the community argument. Cool. So we are at some amounts of minutes. We're at 1 minute. So let's have a look at the ballot. I think since you're a trainee, you don't fill in the ballot, but we can talk through it since the other panelists dropped, unfortunately. Cool.
Sure.
Usually going fourth to first. So the team that came fourth with closing government, we had Aidan speaking first and second. In terms of speaker skill, do you think it is correct to say that the arguments are frequently relevant, has some explanation, but there's regular significant logical gaps, and it's, do you think that's fair for closing government?
Works for me.
Cool. I think that's universally true for both of their speeches. Would you be fine with giving a pair of 72s for both speeches?
Works for sure.
Cool. If the only person, okay, I'll mark this one. Then we came the team that came third. Daniel spoke first, Darris spoke second. I think they're both within the higher bracket, elevated to the next stage of brackets, but I think there is a difference in speakers. So I think opposition whip enters into arguments almost exclusively relevant and address most of the core issues, but there's deficits of explanation or peripheral or irrelevant argumentation, particularly on the argumentation of responsive work. Do you think this is fair for opposition whip to be in the 76 to 78 bracket?
I think it's fair, but I do have a preference for I think whip more. So if whip can get more than the first speaker, that would be better.
Yeah, I do think the members in the lower bracket, I think some of their arguments most of their arguments are actually chronically underdeveloped, unfortunately, but tend to still be logical. I think they are quite vulnerable to competent responses, as we pointed out in the opposition bench comparison. So I do think the member of opposition is in the different bracket, but the higher end of that.
I think they're in the same bracket, but I think I like Whip's speech a bit better because Whip's speech had more sort of nuances as opposed to the member speech.
Right. I think the distinction in nuance means they're probably in different brackets. So I think Daniel will probably be a 74 or 75.
Yeah,
You agree?
Yeah,
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that's what I meant. So like the different scores, but a bit higher for the will.
Yeah. So 74 for Daniel, 76 for Darius. Going to the team that came second, which was opening opposition, Eric spoke first, Mary spoke second. I think it is a similar story here, whereas Eric's arguments, whilst they are better developed than Daniel's in terms of substantive, I do think it's Mary in the DPM that is doing a lot more both of the mechanistic work and responsive work. So I do think Mary now is still in the same bracket as opposition width, as in arguments are almost exclusively relevant, but maybe sometimes have deficits of explanation. But Eric is still within the same bracket as member. So you think the member spoke as well as Prime Minister?
I think they were both fairly similar and both equally
Yeah.
good. I'm fine with equal scores to both of them.
Cool. So that would be Eric would be a 74, and then obviously to make the math work, but also it's true that I think Mary is a 77, as in the speech becomes there's less of simplicity. There are some good argumentation, but they do slip sometimes in the deficit of explanation. Each claim has a mechanism to it, but I think that mechanism is underexplained. Do you agree? So 74, 77?
Agreed.
Cool. Last but not least, opening opposition. Fernando speaking first, and Gulia, that person speaking second. I think they're still within the same bracket, but a high level of the brackets. So I think it's just the critiques I had of Mary's speech would also apply to both opening oppositions, but just slightly less so. So you think the leader of opposition spoke as well as Mary?
I think leader of opposition was a bit better because I think Mary was not really able to counter what leader of opposition actually set up in the frame and the argumentation.
So then that would be a pair of 78s for LO and DLO. Yeah,
Cool, works.
does that sound good? Yeah, cool.
Sounds
So I'll
good.
just cool. Cool. So I'll just submit the ballot then, making sure we. Yep. Cool. Would you mind getting the teams from the break room? That's okay.
Sure. I'll do that.
Thank you. Okay. Do we have at least one member from each team here? Do we have opening government here?
Yes.
Cool. Opening opposition.
Yeah, always here.
Cool. CG
Here.
and CO. Okay, I saw Daniel on these. I'm gonna presume that yeah. Cool. Thanks everyone for the debate. The way it's going to work, I'm going to give you some general commentary about how we thought this round went, the call, and then the justification for that call. Not too surprising how that structure is. So in terms of general commentary, we thought the debate was largely, intuitive. The argumentation people were running were generally sound and correct. We do think there are maybe three areas all teams could focus on. First is the POI engagement. So POIs are an important part of the game, but also really important to not just offer responsive interactions in the round. We think there is an example in this round where one POI was quite important in a closer comparison, but it's just generally good to utilize POIs in order to re-solidify your case and offer weighing, etc. The second is mechanization here was oftentimes either lacking or only the first step of the mechanization was done. What this means is oftentimes the mechanization was underdeveloped to completion. So you would offer some justifications for why the world might be X or people might behave in a Y, but not why lots of manifestations happen like X and other people behave like Y. And indeed, there was, in the third commentary, A lot of times teams weren't responding to the mechanization other teams were providing for their argumentation, but instead providing parallel mechanization to the inverse claim. This is fine, but it isn't as robust as the defensive challenge and leaves a bit too much up to the judge's delineation, right? You want to make sure you're really clear about, if you're going to provide parallel mechanization, why that is more persuasive than the mechanization, and reasoning other teams have provided for the opposite. Cool. So the call then, we had very similar intuitions. The call is unanimous. The call is as follows. The first went to opening opposition, the second to opening government, the third to closing opposition, the fourth, unfortunately, to closing government. I think the closest comparison in the round is the long diagonal comparison, and I'll explain why it is close when I get to it. Cool. So let's go through the justifications. I'm not going to summarize everything teams have provided. I'm just going to try to explain what the important levels of each interaction was, why that interaction was particularly important, and why it determined the way it did. So on the top half comparison, both teams are agreeing generally what the metric is, which is sort of the instrumental utilization of this language. So the question is negative language focused music useful for improving either negative relationships or making individuals, feel better within their negativity? This is the mutually agreed metric, so this is the metric we're going to use to weigh the top half per judge manual. So there are 4 questions under this that are important to understand why the clash goes to opening opposition. The first is there is a contestation of what the relationships look like. So opening government says these are just all types of general relationships. Opening opposition, which is to frame specifically romantic relationships. DPM then pushes back by saying it's an assertive challenge that opening opposition is making, and obviously a negative language music would apply to different instances. This is important in terms of the power of opening opposition's contextualization. So how does it get resolved? It gets resolved in 2 ways. The first is opening government is correct that it is somewhat assertive that we're talking about romantic type instances predominantly, but opening opposition does, I think, gesture sufficiently both within LO and DLO that they're not trying to claim it's only romantic music or music about romance or love that has negative language, but it's rather these are the types of songs that we will tend to listen to more often and thus tend to get more exposure. So the way this first clash resolves is I don't think we're exclusively talking about romantic relationships, but we are, for most people, talking about romantic type language, etc. This doesn't actually massively shift the comparative of the round. It just means that we're just now talking about a different type of contextualization. That is the first challenge that exists in the round. It's not really the most important interaction on top half, but it is something just to get out of the way. The second then is a question of what types of artists are crafting this language. Opening government leaves this largely bare in PM, so there's not really any justification if there are different types of artists being able to produce this music. Leader of opposition and DLO construct the argument that who is actually going to be more likely to produce negative language are people who have themselves had a negative type of experience. PM themselves says this within their own argumentation by saying the reason this is so bad is artists are talking about it in real life trauma. Opening opposition positions this in a more nuanced way by saying there are types of people who are more oppressed than others, and those that are more likely to be able to utilize and want to utilize negative language, either gender minorities or people who are of racial underclass, for instance. These are the people who are now more likely to be representative of this on this platform. I think there are a lot more that opening opposition could have done with this. There could have been a good principled argumentation about why we should have these people more represented, etc. But nevertheless, we now think there are people who have more of a lived experience of negative of negativity that are ones able to express this. This is important because there are some gestures across the top half about how authentic the expression of this language is and how meaningful this expression is. However, this, once again, is not too determinate, but it becomes important in the off-bench comparison later. So this point then, probably talking about romance type relationships are the ones we're predominantly going to end up talking about. And the people who are going to talk about are probably who do have a level of lived experience, both OG and OO agreeing on this, but OO are trying to position this by saying this is the reason why people will be more authentic with their expression, but uniquely are able to get more catharsis from that expression because it's a representation of their lived experience. But to be fair to PM, he himself says this. They themselves say this, rather. Third question is, what is the counterfactual? Opening government says slightly less negative content. Opening opposition says it's going to be more positive argumentation, more positive language use. This isn't really that useful. All it does is shift the margins of how much people are affected until the DLO argumentation about what the core comparative is, which is they gesture that in a world without the expression of language, negative language in music, the status quo stigmatization about negative expressions, being able not to be sad or cry or dwell on this, would take domination, which means insofar as people would like to express the negativity, it's only through this means of language in this type of music that you're able to do so. This is an first important point of interaction, is this does produce mutual exclusivity in the round quite strongly, why negative language is important. This is particularly important for the first challenge against opening government. So opening government in DPM says negative language use can be important, but only if it's in nuanced communities that allow for long form content, and these would exist on the other side, on the counterfactual. Opening opposition's challenge to say there was a general stigmatization would prevent people from accessing the type of community that opening government thinks would exist without this type of music. So even if it's true, and opening opposition never contests this, that there are other forms of communities that could exist outside if we do not have, long form, negative honed language use in music. But now opening opposition says people won't access this content. Which means in terms of being able to access the community, this challenge from opening opposition says there is now a genuine comparative of people just being able to access communities that they're going to feel comfortable talking about their negative thoughts with. So then we go to the actual genuine and important part and the thing that is actually determining the crash, which what is this manifestation of language use? Like, is the dissemination good or not? Is the community good or not? Is the reflection on trauma good or not? Opening government's first challenge here is to say people will try to replicate through romanticization and role model effects the same type of negativity that people in their lives are expressing as trauma. Opening opposition have a number of responses to this. The first is to say the most extreme instances are unlikely to be true, as in the people who are likely to harm themselves by aspects of romanticization of parasocial relationships are likely to form this anyway. This, I think, is true at the end of top half. There's no unique justification by opening up into why parasocial relationships or the types of community stuff are a unique product of unique language. Of negative language, as opposed to a example of how negative language can create this community. The absence of analysis to why negative language can uniquely and exclusively create the types of harms you're talking about mean opening opposition response here is correct, which is the people who are likely maybe going to harm themselves or do extreme actions. There are other things in society, like their own mental state or other types of communities they would form into anyway, that will engender that same reaction in them. This is a good challenge to opening government. It means we've got rid of the most extreme harms by opening government. This isn't to defeat opening government. Opening government have to do other things they could say. They say there are bad actors like Lana Del Rey who may, perform their trauma in ways that are harmful to people, that the romanticization is nature, how people romanticize the language based on their own lived experience, precludes logic and dramatizes. You don't want to get rid of it because of identity formation, etc. How does opening opposition get around this material? First is by explaining that by becoming more aware of it, not only does it represent your own lived experience anyway, so these are the things you're thinking about anyway, but it gives you the language and tools to be able to express this to other individuals, which is why nature gives you a degree of validation and representation. The reason that this is important is I don't think either team gets to the burden they expressed at the start of their speeches. I don't think either team gets out the argument of, proves the argument you're able to break out of a relationship now, we're now uniquely able to ask for help to a large level. I think there's a lot of burdens missing within this argument. The thing that we are weighing, which I do think does meet that level of satisfaction analysis, is just how do people feel about this? And I think opening opposition are able to demonstrate people are likely to feel validated and represented and give a degree of knowledge and expression even to their small communities about this, which I do think is a comparative declaration of why they're uniquely able to do this with negative language in music, as opposed to opening governments larger gested argumentation, which I think is largely a defensive push about why you wouldn't be able to do this through things like romanticization. This isn't to say opening government don't prove to me that there are some people who would romanticize it and do it harmfully, but I think opening opposition has gestured sufficiently that those people are likely less comparative in the round than opening opposition people who need that type of representation, particularly because of the repression stuff that comes with opening opposition. And indeed, I think there is sufficient signaling to opening government, even though it comes out in DLO. I think the POI that goes to Prime Minister about why extreme behaviors are unlikely to manifest or question intuition is sufficient to recognize this. Then at the end of top half, we are more clear that negative language-focused music improves people's feeling of representation. The language which they're able to be provided to be used is not likely on net to be bad. And having a community, even if sometimes it can be quite toxic, as opening government provides, is either uncomparative, but is uniquely beneficial if you're able to feel as if you could access it, which is what opening position says is important. That is how we determine the top half. How does the rest of the debate fall into this? Closing government has largely two extensions. Firstly, they describe that this is damaging to artists because it forces artists to comply with creating negative language music when otherwise they wouldn't. And this is particularly true because the music industry is more restrictive of what individuals are allowed to do, which means you have to, tend to the trend that already exists. The first thing to say about this argument is, whilst it is true in isolation, it's unclear why it is not comparatively true in the inverse. As in, if it's the case that opposition bench are talking about promoting positive music, why is therefore there's not a symmetric number of artists that wouldn't like to perform positive music? In which case, why isn't there just a forced compliance from different groups of actors on either side of the house? This then would depend upon a justification to why it's uniquely harmful to compel an actor to do bad music when otherwise they wouldn't want to, as opposed to compel them to do good music when otherwise they'd want to. Absence of this justification, then this first extension becomes largely uncomparative in the round, as in we just think there's coercion on either side of the house as a result. The second then, and this is a stronger argument from closing governments, is about escapism, as in music would prevent self-reflection, even if it does offer moments of tranquility, and therefore people don't want to go out to help themselves. The reason here is because it's too energetic to do so. So if you have music that makes you feel good, that is sufficient. This is then on the same clash angle as opening government about is this the tipping point to making people behave differently or not? I do think the reason closing government, the only reason closing government has to explain why this is a difference is in itself a symmetric reason, which is it's energetically hard to reach out to individuals. I'm unsure why, if opening government themselves say that very many people don't have an alternative like a friend or a job to reach out to, why closing government appealing to opening government's characterization is true, as in this implies that you want to have at least something rather than nothing. But even if closing government is talking about people who do have other alternatives, the energy barrier stuff seems to be harder to get around for closing government than the way in which idealization works, language dissemination works, the nature of the community works with opening government, which we can understand would actually have a unique comparative harm to the round than saying it actually gives you catharsis, even if it makes you not reach out. The second thing to say is, even if it is true that closing government are providing, I think it could also be true that we're providing a unique reason why people are able now to reach out. That's where the end of the argument goes. So, okay, people are now more able to reach out, but does reaching out actually go well? Does it mean people's mental health does improve because they reach out? That is the same problem that kind of exists on top half with. I'm left unclear why, even if people reach out more and are more aware of toxic relationships, does that actually mean the toxic relationships collapse? And if the collapses happens, does that mean the comparative is better for these people? Does the mental health that people have better just because they reach out to people? Those questions are more uncertain to me than the theory of top half of how people emotionally and cathartically respond to things like representation or able to have language use or not. Those things are more tangible in the round and closer to burden satisfaction. The arguments are being reached out to. Thus, the mechanization for opening government is more solid on this clash angle than closing government. So that's the two reasons why I think closing government analytically and by clash interaction are losing to opening government. Same story to opening opposition here. So opening opposition, while closing government does challenge the margin of proof of opening opposition's claims, which I think is fair and correct, there is still a margin of proof to opening opposition's claims about why individuals are able to get unique catharsis. Specifically, I think the strongest point of opening opposition is on that argument about on the counterfactual people wouldn't want to reach out because of stigmatization, which means even if closing government is true that you reduce the energy barrier to reaching out, that doesn't preclude opening opposition from being true that people wouldn't reach out anyway. So all you're precluding on the short diagonal is people getting some catharsis and some escapism, which seems clearly why that's a good thing. Some relief is better than no relief. So in that frame interaction, that would need a response to by closing government to opening opposition. We don't find this, and this is the strongest reason why we're closing government under opening opposition. Finally, last but not least, closing opposition. Closing opposition generates a few extensions. The first is an idea about that negative music is a reflection of actual people's needs, and indeed, secondarily, is needed for political action. There are some additional mechanization exemplification by opposition whip to describe that this is by its nature underrepresentation of minorities, as in the status quo, negative music. So the rise of streaming means that minority artists are able to get onto streaming platforms and allows them to have a common language through their struggle. How does this interact firstly with opposition bench? I do think whilst closing opposition offers some unique material or stuff about why there's positive music still, and that there's still a market for positive music like the shopping mall stuff, which I do think does on the back half marginalize closing government extensively by saying that there will still be some aspects of positive music individuals could buy into. And that means artists who would want to do positive music, there's still a market to them. Maybe it's smaller, but there still is a market to them, so it's not as coercive as closing government wanted it to be. Does nevertheless still gesture that negative music is motivational and galvanizing, which is the top half clash, particularly in their case for political activism. How does this analysis we find less persuasive than top half? There are a few metrics here. The first is just margin of proof. So whilst it is true that there are some aspects of negative music that particularly opposition whip points to, as in it's communal, it's motivating, etc., and a recognition of struggle and a provision of common language, a lot of this is either things that opening opposition has said, or to the credit of closing opposition, things that are explained differently, but not explained comparatively. So whilst you're gesturing that these things couldn't happen by positive music, it's unclear to me why having positive language doesn't allow you to express communal struggle or doesn't allow you to recognize struggle. Indeed, opening opposition say it's also true that negative language uniquely accesses struggle. Closing opposition don't have any additional mechanization to explain, and this is the question I would have for opening opposition, why that is true. They just rest upon that for political action. So when it comes to political action, the thing I'm weighing on opposition benches, does political galvanization more likely than not improve people's mental health than a recognition of that struggle, which is opening opposition's world? I think opening opposition's analysis burden is lower than closing governments, but then maybe people are more politically active and donate more in closing opposition's world. That's a few steps away from mental health improvement, as in if your argument is politics will now get funded to produce mental health treatment for people, that burden is massively under-mechanized relative to opening opposition, so you get validated a bit more because you see people giving you self-affirmation. The second is there's a strong comparative strength in opening oppositions, particularly on the argument of why you need this to reduce stigmatization of negativity, which actually reduces the margin of their claim of recognition. Political action doesn't have that same margin, and I'm unsure why this music is the tipping point that produces a change in political action, considering there's lots of other things that are preventing political action, etc. Absence of that comparative strength, opening opposition has stronger comparative strength. The third is on responsive challenges. This is bringing in then the long diagonal, is a lot of the community arguments and it race to extreme arguments opening unprovided. Opening opposition do challenge very successfully by saying these people would do extreme actions anyway, the community can be filtered, etc. The closing opposition's only response here is to say that the people in the role models of that community would self-monitor, but DPM has said that those people themselves can be bad actors or actors that we don't think are expressing messages we desire. This is a DPM example of Lana Del Rey, for instance. This is an exemplification of why the long diagonal becomes close, because whilst there's parallel mechanization across both benches, both teams, there's an absence of engagement by closing opposition to opening government on why the community would actually be galvanizing rather than echoing, echo chamber-esque and a race to the bottom that makes you feel bad or give in to the trauma more, for instance. So it's a clash of motivation and doing an action. This depends upon the nature of that community. There's an absence of response by closing opposition to why the nature of the community isn't bad, as opening government says, and that there isn't better communities that have engaged in long-form content that people would engage with otherwise, which is the DPM material. Absence of this, then, closing opposition might be true that political action is important, maybe even more important than the clash of catharsis, although I do think catharsis is a route to why people would get politically engaged, because the main mechanism here is you galvanize and want to be motivated, which by its nature is a cathartic clash rather than a consequential clash. Without this explanation to why the community is better than other alternatives that would exist absence of this, then you're losing to opening government. Also, you're losing to opening government on the argument of this community being toxic for certain types of people. You don't have the same response opening opposition successfully had to why this was not true. This is the few reasons why you're losing to opening oppositions, the margin of proof, comparative strength, responsive challenge. Last but not least, on the back half, member of opposition, I think, demonstrates that there is, as I said, a market for positive music, marginalizing comparative even further. Government Whip does, I think, point out quite successfully that there are other forms of media that can motivate political action. I think this is a good challenge to the political action argument, but it isn't necessarily a sufficient challenge about why the negative music is uniquely galvanizing. So whilst it is true that Government Whip points out problems in closing opposition have also pointed out problems in closing government. Secondarily, closing government, I think, does gesture that there needs to be more proof in government opposition bench to why it is galvanizing, but closing opposition to the credit have given some justification, as in there's common language, more individuals are likely to be able to be galvanized by a negative message because it's an identification of struggle. Whilst this is under-mechanized relative to opening government, who themselves say that the language can be abused and tokenized if it is produced into the mainstream, closing government doesn't have that type of response. I'm still left thinking that the negative language can be useful in more instances than not by closing opposition, which is sufficient to say there's some motivation. So even if it's not enough political action, it's still motivating to some degree, which is important if closing government is themselves are talking about the level to which people are motivated to either get help or just motivated in general. And closing opposition are doing enough of a job here to say that negative language would be. That is how we saw the debate. If you have any questions, queries, clarifications, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll stick on the Zoom if it's easy to do. It probably will be easier to get me if you get me now. Good luck for the future rounds.